The Five Poppies Resort was designed to sell serenity, curated sunsets, whisper quiet corridors, the sort of luxury that insists nothing dangerous could possibly bloom behind its glass. Yet deep beneath the manicured terraces, fluorescent lights shivered over a laboratory that felt more like a confession booth. Every surface gleamed with the false promise of control. That was where Britt Westbourne stood, heart pounding against a steel-braced comm, a blinking ankle monitor spitting out time in cold, unfeeling numbers. The resort brochure promised mineral springs and meditation. The lab offered a countdown. It was a precise, humiliating kind of terror, the kind that turned a physician into a hostage and the smartest person in the room into someone bargaining with the laws of physics. Britt had already decided on her story because stories are how you wrestle chaos into something you can look in the eye. Pascal acted alone. He was a zealot with an engineer's toolkit and an empty conscience, the kind of man who mistakes theatrics for power. She repeated that conclusion like a mantra as equipment hummed around her and the anklet's micro-LED winked its heartless rhythm. If he was a lone saboteur, maybe this was containable. Maybe no one else would pay for his vanity. It was a fragile narrative, but fragile narratives have a way of keeping panic from taking the wheel. When Pascal refused to release her, when he backed away with the jittery grace of a falconer letting a hawk fly toward prey, Britt watched certainty and mercy peel away in the same breath. His last look wasn't guilt, it was hunger, hunger to see what a person became at zero. He left her with the echo of his footsteps and the low electronic metronome of doom. Elsewhere in the resort's underbelly, a different clock was running. Vaughn and Jocelyn had wrestled their way out of zip ties and bad odds, breath hot with adrenaline, the taste of duct tape still ghosting their tongues. They rounded a corner into something brutal. A guard's forearm dug beneath Jason Morgan's jaw, a choke that didn't care whether its victim was a legend or a statistic. Joss didn't measure the angles like a hero in a training montage. She swung with a survivor's simplicity, a metal rod crashing against bone, a grunt, a body slumping in surprise. The sound of the guard hitting the ground rang like a gavel. Jason met Jocelyn's eyes with a dozen unasked questions. Are you hurt? How long have you been here? What did they make you see? But triage is a language he speaks fluently. Priority isn't a debate, it's a compass, and Britt, strapped to a ticking problem, was the north he couldn't ignore. He ran. Not the panicked sprint of a man fleeing fear, but the controlled cadence of someone moving toward it. The corridors felt longer going back, the ceiling lower, the light harsher. When he slid through the lab's threshold, Britt stood rigid, chin set in defiance that couldn't quite hide the tremor in her hands. Her eyes flicked to the anklet and back to his face, a quick accounting of faith versus risk. She told him what any rational person would: you can't do this. Not here, not now. You can't outmuscle chemistry or outglare a detonator. Her words weren't cowardice, they were the math of survival. If he stayed, 2 people might die instead of 1. If he left, at least the children would have a champion on the outside. It was a clinical argument wearing the mask of compassion, and she hated that it sounded like begging. Jason didn't argue. He never needed a podium when a principal would do. "We walk out together," he said, and the way he said it made the space feel larger, as if the room had to make room for that certainty. He crouched beside the anklet, eyes sweeping the housing, cataloging the seams and tamper points, listening for the telltale song of a tilt switch or a pressure plate. He wasn't a bomb tech, but he was fluent in stubborn machines and the people who build them. He mapped the logic like a lockpicker tracing tumblers through vibration. A primary charge with a dead man trigger, likely a secondary accelerant meant purely to punish interference, and a failsafe wired to panic. The trick was to make the anklet believe nothing was happening while absolutely everything was. Britt kept breathing evenly because controlled oxygen is the cheapest anesthesia. She fixed her gaze on a stain in the ceiling tile and thought about everything except goodbyes. Somewhere in the building, Pascal began to count down, his voice oiled and theatrical over the intercom, the kind of staged menace that pretends to be omnipotence. It wasn't just pressure, it was narrative warfare. He wanted them to hear the clock in a human tone, to mistake performance for inevitability. Jason ignored it the way you ignore weather forecasts once the storm is already in your yard. He slid a tool beneath the casing, lifted an absurdly delicate latch, and paused until the bomb's tiny brain settled from startled to calm. A breath. A shift. A severed connection that felt like stealing a lie back from its author. The anklet came free with the soft sigh of a bandage peeling from skin. Britt stared at it like it was a snake finally charmed, and the first words she could find were a command dressed as a plea. "Go. Now." The door answered for them, swinging open on a brace of guards whose boots absorbed the last of Pascal's numbers. She didn't need translation to understand their orders: stop the extraction, restore the spectacle. The corridor beyond was a thicket of danger, angles for bullets, corners for ambushes, blind spots that could hold anything. Then the thicket parted. Vaughn stepped into frame, gun in a two-handed grip that promised competence rather than swagger. He didn't call out or pose, he just moved, decisive and clean, a narrow river cutting through. Jocelyn slid to Britt's side, hands quick and firm, the kind of help that doesn't ask for permission because love has allegations more urgent than manners. Jason took point with a predator's economy. It didn't look like he was hunting so much as preventing the world from catching up. They ran. Running is ugly and necessary. It turns every hallway into a question about who you want to be when you survive it. The lab spat them into a service corridor that smelled like bleach and guilt. They hit the exterior door just as Pascal's theater achieved its climax. The explosion wasn't the cinematic fireball of an action reel, it was a concussion that punched sound apart, lifted air, and slapped the ground into them with the intimacy of a wave. The blast swatted them down, threw grit into their mouths, wrote stinging sentences across their skin. For a moment the world shrank to tinnitus and white light. Then the light surrendered its arrogance, colors shivered back into being, and the four of them realized that luck had sided with nerve. The building absorbed most of the blast. They had bruises, singed sleeves, ringing ears, and the violent clarity that comes from still having a pulse. Britt rolled onto her back and tasted copper at the edge of her tongue. She found her words lodged beneath a gratitude so sharp it almost felt like pain. Jason had moved over her on instinct when the shockwave arrived, body curled in a shield that didn't ask for consent. She recognized the paradox immediately. How do you thank someone for risking everything when that risk terrifies you? You can't keep doing that, she said, voice rough, the rebuke shaky not from anger but from proximity to an ending they had outrun by seconds. He met it with a look that refused to apportion bravery like a resource he was supposed to hoard. Vaughn checked a perimeter that had the decency to stay quiet, while Joss brushed gravel from Britt's hair with hands that shook only when she thought no one was looking. Between aftershocks and sirens, there was a breath that belonged to no one but them. Jason and Britt found each other's eyes in it. What passed between them wasn't a reunion so much as an audit, of choices, of scars, of debts carried and paid. History can be an undertow, it can also be a handrail. They stood in that contradiction until the moment buckled under its own intensity and let in a sliver of ridiculous, restorative human life. Britt's gaze snagged on the ink peeking from beneath Jason's torn sleeve, a design she had always privately judged as one impulsive night too many. I still don't like that tattoo, she said, entirely too solemn for the absurdity of the observation. It was humor as a tourniquet, applied to a wound invisible to strangers. Jason huffed out something that might have been a laugh if laughing didn't pull at bruises. Jocelyn, who had seen both of them stitched back together and torn apart more times than the universe should ask of one town, rolled her eyes in a way that said she wasn't ready for a grand romance but could tolerate a joke. Practicalities resumed their jurisdiction. Sirens approached, the honest kind this time. Smoke climbed in exasperated spirals from a side wing of the resort where Pascal had wanted legend. He had achieved only property damage and evidence. Vaughn scanned for a second wave that didn't come, the gun at his side suddenly heavy with the moral weight of its usefulness. He looked at Joss, and 1,000 unfinished conversations crowded the space between them. They shelved them with the efficiency of people who planned to survive long enough to revisit the shelf. Britt, legs rubbery but functional, assessed her own body like a clinician and decided the diagnosis was alive. That would do for the hour. She allowed herself a single beat of surrender, to lean into Jason's steadiness, to let his hand find her elbow, not because she needed rescuing but because intimacy, properly understood, is a mutual act of balance. When a blast peels a mask from a building, it tends to peel a few from the people who inhabit it. Britt's insistence that Pascal had been acting alone began to wilt under the heat of what they had just witnessed. Lone zealots rarely operate inside resorts with laboratories and intercom theatrics. Infrastructure implies investment. Investment implies an organization that writes checks for silence and has a remarkable tolerance for spectacle. If Pascal had been the architect, someone richer had supplied the steel. Britt didn't say any of that aloud, she didn't need to. Jason already wore that suspicion like a second shirt, and Joss had learned too quickly that one explosion is seldom the finale. It's usually the preface to a larger inquiry no one wants to conduct and everyone must. The ambulance crew would arrive to declare bruises normal and ask whether anyone had lost consciousness. The police would want statements, and the statements would fracture truth into manageable slices because trauma tells the truth in loops, not lines. There would be paperwork, and then there would be silence, and in that silence the next decisions would bloom. Britt felt the shape of one decision before she had the courage to name it: distance. Not because Jason had failed her, he had done the opposite, but because orbiting him always altered her gravity. Protecting the children, protecting herself, protecting the future she pretended to believe was still negotiable, those arguments piled up like sandbags. She told him to stay away, and it wasn't a punishment, it was a preemptive bandage, a clumsy attempt to control an infection called consequence. But love stories, especially the complicated sort Port Charles specializes in, are not governed by zoning laws or declarations made while your ears are still ringing. They are buildable and breakable in the same breath. They are made of rescues that feel like vows and silences that feel like betrayals, of unwelcome laughter at the sight of a bad tattoo and the instinct to cover someone else's body with your own when the air turns violent. Britt could wish for distance and mean it and fail at it, all within a week. Jason could promise nothing and deliver everything. Jocelyn and Vaughn, who had just proven they could navigate a maze armed with only courage and timing, might discover that the exit wasn't the end of their entanglement but the start of a more honest one. And somewhere under the soot of the resort, a money man would be tallying losses, convincing himself that explosions discourage investigations. He would be wrong. By the time the blue and red lights painted the resort's pale walls, the four, because that's what they had been for a few searing minutes, a unit assembled by crisis, had already made an unspoken pact that outlived the blast. It wasn't about loyalty to an institution or a mission brief, it was about refusing to let someone else write the story that ends with them as collateral. They would talk to the authorities. They would choose their silences strategically. They would rest because the body insists. But none of them would mistake survival for victory. Survival is a receipt. Victory is a verdict still waiting on testimony. Later, in a different room with gentler lighting and the kind of quiet that forgives trembling hands, Britt would wash soot from her skin and find scorch marks on the cuff of her jacket. She would press 2 fingers to the faint indent the anklet had left on her ankle and think about how control is often an illusion purchased with expensive lighting and colder hearts. She would picture Pascal's retreat and hear again the counterfeit confidence in his countdown, then picture the detonator's quiet surrender in Jason's hands. She would think about the children, about the ethics of drawing fire, about what it costs to love someone who walks toward danger as naturally as most people walk toward the kitchen at dawn. She would draft a speech promising boundaries and self-preservation and then, if she was honest, she would imagine what it might sound like to abandon the script. On the resort's lawn, daylight tried to pretend nothing had happened. It fell evenly on broken glass and intact blossoms, indifferent and gorgeous. Reporters would soon descend with microphones and questions shaped like traps. Administrators would produce carefully laminated statements about isolated incidents and full cooperation. Guests would whisper that they had always suspected something was off about the spa's lower level. And the city would do what it always does when the veil slips. It would watch to see who steps forward, who steps back, and who pretends their feet are cemented to the ground. In that gallery of reactions, Jason and Britt would occupy a familiar, volatile middle space, pulled together by catastrophe, pushed apart by the arithmetic of keeping people safe. The 5 poppies promised tranquility. What it delivered instead was clarity, a clear sightline to the awful glamour of control and the better, braver beauty of defiance. Britt believed, for a while, that Pascal acted alone because that belief made the world livable. Now she knows the world will not be made livable by wishful math. It will be made livable by choosing, again and again, to move toward one another when the air goes loud, to improvise tenderness in the margins of danger, to joke about a bad tattoo precisely because death tried and failed to get the last word. Complicated love stories rarely end with an explosion. They keep unwinding long after the smoke has drifted into memory. What happened beneath the resort wasn't an ending. It was a thesis. And whether they like it or not, the 4 people who ran through that thesis together are now responsible for the footnotes.